Hey everyone, welcome back to Meteorology Matters.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about, forecasting and understanding typical weather patterns, but what about those events that just seem to defy explanation? Those moments when you look up at the sky and think, what in the world is going on? Well, today we're going to explore some of those unusual weather events, and we've got a fascinating discussion lined up. And before we dive in, a quick reminder to follow meteorologist Rob Jones on Instagram, meteorologist on TikTok, TV meteorologist, and on YouTube, follow Rob Jones Hurricane. You can also find the Meteorology Matters playlist there. Okay, so let's start by taking a trip back in time to 1950s San Francisco. Imagine this bustling city, right? But instead of the usual hustle and bustle, there's this unsettling red tinge to the fog. It's like something out of a movie, right? It's true. It wasn't a scene from a Hitchcock film, though. It was a real event, a top-secret military experiment called Operation Sea Spray. Operation Sea Spray. That sounds ominous. What exactly happened?
Well, what's so captivating about Operation Sea Spray is that it involved the deliberate release of a bacteria called Serratia marcescens into the air over San Francisco.
Wait, they released bacteria over the city on purpose?
Yeah, the idea was to study how a potential bioweapon might spread through a densely populated area.
So they basically turned the city into a giant open-air laboratory.
Yes, and they use Serratia marcescens specifically because it produces this bright red pigment, made it easy to track its dispersal.
Okay, so they could see where it went, but what did they find?
Well, what they found was that the bacteria spread much farther and wider than they anticipated. It even reached suburbs miles away from where it was released.
Wow, so it really got around, huh? It's a little unnerving to think about, but was this bacteria actually harmful?
Well, that's where things get a little complicated. See, at the time, Serratia marcescens was thought to be mostly harmless. It was really only known for, causing discoloration in food. But shortly after the experiment, there was this unusual spike in cases of things like urinary tract infections and pneumonia in San Francisco. And guess what? They identified Serratia marcescens as the culprit.
Oh, no. So an experiment that was intended to understand the risks of a bioweapon ended up causing real harm to the city's population.
Yeah, it's a tragic situation. One patient who was already recovering from surgery actually passed away.
That's awful. It really makes you question the ethics and oversight of an operation like that.
It absolutely does, and it serves as a stark reminder of the potential for these unforeseen consequences, especially when you're dealing with something as complex and unpredictable as, the environment.
Definitely. And I think this event really played a significant role in shaping those future regulations surrounding bioweapon research, didn't it?
It did.
It's a cautionary tale for sure. It reminds us to think critically about the impact of human actions on the natural world. It kind of makes you wonder, right? Are there similar events happening today that we might not even be aware of?
It certainly makes you think.
Okay. Well, speaking of unexplained events, let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of this peculiar fog that's been plaguing parts of Florida. Now, you mentioned earlier that Florida has a fog season. Can you explain that a bit more for our listeners?
Sure, yeah. Florida typically experiences this period of increased fog, from late fall to early spring. And it's due to a combination of factors. You have cooling temperatures, ample moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, and, calm wind conditions.
So fog itself isn't unusual in Florida, but recently there have been reports of fog with some pretty unusual characteristics. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so there have been reports of this unusually dense fog, almost like a thick smoke, and it's accompanied by this strange, almost chemical odor.
A chemical odor? Now that's strange. Have there been any reports of people experiencing, health problems or anything like that?
There have been. Some residents have reported experiencing, respiratory issues and other health concerns. So there's definitely a lot of anxiety surrounding this fog.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
So what do we know about the potential causes of this? Is there anything to be concerned about?
Well, it's important to approach these reports with, a balance of concern and skepticism. While fog can trap and amplify existing odors, making them more noticeable, it doesn't typically have a smell of its own.
Yeah.
So that chemical smell, it could be originating from a nearby source that's just being, magnified by the fog.
So the fog itself might not be the culprit, but rather just carrying an existing smell.
Exactly.
That makes sense. But what about the reported health effects? Could the fog itself be causing those respiratory issues?
It's possible. While it's true that fog can worsen, respiratory problems, especially for folks with asthma or other sensitivities, it's important to consider other factors too. Winter is a time when viruses are more prevalent, and the symptoms that are being reported could just be related to a seasonal illness rather than the fog itself.
Right, so it might be a case of mistaken identity.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have this strange fog in Florida that's causing quite a stir. It's a good reminder that while we might understand the basics of weather phenomena like fog, there's still many nuances and complexities that can surprise us.
There are.
And sometimes, the answer might not be as dramatic or sinister as we initially suspect.
That's very true.
Okay, well, let's shift gears again to a completely different weather event, the extremely cold winter that much of the country just experienced. I mean, I know a lot of folks were bundled up in their warmest layers for months on end.
Yeah, it was a long one. This past winter saw below average temperatures across a huge portion of the United States. Kentucky, for instance. They experienced some exceptionally frigid conditions.
It really felt like we were stuck in a deep freeze for ages. What I found particularly interesting, though, was that despite this record-breaking cold, many areas actually experienced below-average snowfall. How is that possible?
That's a great observation, and it speaks to the complexities of weather patterns you see. While it might seem counterintuitive, warmer temperatures, even in winter, can actually lead to less snowfall overall.
Wait, so warmer temperatures even in winter can mean less snow. That seems kind of backwards.
It does, but it highlights the interconnected nature of our climate system. You see, climate change is leading to overall warmer temperatures, which ironically can sometimes result in less snow in certain regions, even though those same regions are experiencing periods of, extreme cold.
So we've got this strange mix of extreme cold and below-average snowfall.
Mm.
What's the story behind that? Is there a scientific explanation for this unusual combination?
Well, one factor to consider is the polar vortex, that large area of low pressure and cold air that circulates around the
The
Arctic.
polar vortex.
Right. Sometimes this vortex can weaken and split, sending surges of that frigid Arctic air southward.
So the polar vortex is like this swirling mass of cold air that occasionally, dips down from the Arctic, bringing the chill with it.
Precisely. And this winter, we saw a particularly strong southward dip of the polar vortex, which explains, those widespread cold temperatures. However, snowfall is influenced by a multitude of factors, including the amount of moisture in the atmosphere and the, tracks of storm systems.
So even though the polar vortex brought the cold, the conditions weren't necessarily right for significant snowfall in many areas.
That's right. It's a reminder that weather is a complex system with many interconnected parts. Just because one element is extreme doesn't necessarily mean others will follow suit.
It's fascinating, isn't it, these unusual weather events like the mysterious fog in Florida and the record-breaking cold with less snow. It really makes you think about the intricate workings of our planet's atmosphere.
It does.
And on that note, we'll wrap up part one of our discussion on unusual weather events. Stay tuned for part two, where we'll delve deeper into the science behind these events and explore their potential implications for the future.
It really is. And it just shows how important it is to, keep researching and observing so we can better understand these complex weather patterns.
Yeah, for sure. Now let's dive back into this polar vortex for a bit. I'm curious to understand exactly how this swirling mass of cold air,
Yeah.
manages to plunge so far south and what role it played in those unusual weather patterns we've been discussing.
Okay, so imagine the polar vortex like a spinning top, right? It's typically confined to the Arctic region. It's held in place by this band of strong winds high up in the atmosphere called the polar jet stream. Now, when this jet stream weakens or becomes kind of wavy, it can allow the polar vortex to, bulge or even split, sending loaves of that frigid Arctic air southward.
Okay, so a wavy jet stream lets the polar vortex escape, kind of like a crack in a dam unleashing cold air into those lower latitudes.
That's a great analogy. And this winter, a combination of factors, things like high pressure over the Arctic and this unusual warming in the stratosphere, they disrupted the jet stream, allowing the polar vortex to make that southward excursion.
So even though the polar vortex brought the cold, the conditions weren't always right for significant snowfall in many areas, right?
Exactly, snowfall. It isn't just about temperature. It's also heavily influenced by the amount of moisture in the air and the tracks of storm systems. So in many areas that experienced that extreme cold, the air was simply too dry to produce much snowfall.
It's a good reminder that weather is rarely straightforward. But this southward shift in the polar vortex does make you wonder, could climate change be playing a role in these more frequent and dramatic dips?
That's a question scientists are definitely exploring. While polar vortex itself is a natural phenomenon, there's growing evidence suggesting that climate change may be influencing its behavior. Some research indicates that warming in the Arctic, particularly the rapid loss of sea ice, could be altering the jet stream, making it more prone to these wavy patterns that allow the polar vortex to, break free.
So the warming Arctic might actually be contributing to these intense cold snaps in other parts of the world. That's both fascinating and kind of alarming.
It is. It highlights the complex and interconnected nature of our, global climate system. What happens in one region can have ripple effects across the entire planet.
And speaking of ripple effects, let's circle back to that mysterious fog in Florida for a moment. We talked about some possible explanations, but is there any indication that this fog event could be linked to something larger, perhaps even a consequence of a changing climate?
That's a great question, and it's important to emphasize that, drawing definitive links between individual weather events and climate change is a complex process. However, we can look at broader trends as global temperatures rise. We expect to see shifts in weather patterns, including changes in humidity levels and air circulation. These shifts could potentially contribute to, more frequent or intense fog events in certain regions.
So while we can't definitively say that this particular fog event in Florida was caused by climate change, it's possible that we could see more events like it in the future as our climate continues to change.
That's a reasonable conclusion, and it really just underscores the importance of, studying these events, gathering data, and refining our models to better understand how a changing climate might be impacting weather patterns around the globe.
I want to go back to Operation Sea Spray for a moment. The fact that such an experiment was conducted, releasing bacteria over a populated city, it's quite shocking. What were the long-term ramifications of that event, beyond those immediate health concerns?
Operation Sea Spray had a profound impact not just on the scientific community, but also on public perception and policy. The incident raised these serious ethical questions about the use of biological agents, the potential for, unintended consequences, and the need for informed consent in scientific research. It sparked a lot of public outrage, led to congressional hearings, and ultimately it pushed for stricter regulations surrounding, biological research and the development of bioweapons.
So this one event, as unsettling as it was, played a pivotal role in shaping how we approach scientific research and the ethical considerations that come with it.
Absolutely. It serves as a stark reminder that, scientific advancements must always be weighed against their potential impact on human health and the environment. It's a lesson that continues to resonate today as we grapple with these new and emerging technologies.
It makes you realize that our understanding of weather and the atmosphere is constantly evolving. And sometimes it's these unexpected events like Operation Sea Spray or this unusual fog in Florida that force us to re-examine our assumptions and push the boundaries of our knowledge. It's amazing how these seemingly isolated weather events, like the fog in Florida or the record-breaking cold, can actually tell us so much about how interconnected our planet's climate system really is.
It really is. It's like trying to put together this giant puzzle. Each weather event gives us a clue, and as we study those clues, we start to understand the bigger picture, those intricate forces at play.
And as we've been talking about, some of these puzzle pieces are getting weirder, raising those questions about how climate change is shaping these extreme or, unexpected events.
Exactly. While we can't say for sure that any single weather event is directly caused by climate change, we can look at the long-term trends and patterns. What we're seeing is that many of the events we've talked about, like extreme cold, unusual fog shifts and precipitation, they all line up with what climate models have been predicting.
So these unusual events could be like a sneak peek into a future where extreme weather becomes more common and more intense.
It's definitely something we need to think about, and that's why it's so important to keep investing in climate research, monitor these changes and come up with ways to reduce the risks.
Speaking of reducing risks,
Yeah.
what can people do, on an individual level to be part of the solution? It can feel pretty overwhelming when we're talking about these huge global challenges.
It's true. Climate change can feel like this giant problem, but, individual actions, when you multiply them across communities and nations, they can really make a difference. Even simple things like using less energy, choosing sustainable transportation, and supporting policies that promote clean energy, all of that adds up.
So every little bit helps.
Absolutely. And beyond what you do personally, staying informed and being part of the conversation is really important. Support organizations that are working on climate change. Talk to your elected officials about what you're worried about and be a voice for change in your community.
It sounds like knowledge is power in this fight.
Yeah.
The more we understand about climate change and what it might do, the better we can make good decisions and push for real solutions.
I completely agree. We need to give people the knowledge and tools to deal with these complicated challenges.
Well, we've covered a lot today, from that secret bioweapon experiment in 1950 San Francisco to the polar vortex and the strange fog in Florida. Is there one main takeaway you'd like listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the Earth's climate system is incredibly complex and everything's connected. What might seem like a random weather event can often be linked to these bigger global patterns, and as our climate keeps changing, we can expect to see more of these unusual and extreme events. The key is to stay informed, keep learning, and work together to find solutions.
Well said. It's a good reminder that we're all in this together, not just with each other, but with this amazing planet we call home, and it's our job to protect it. A huge thank you to our expert for being here today and sharing your incredible insights. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Meteorology Matters. Don't forget to follow meteorologist Rob Jones on Instagram, meteorologist, on TikTok, TV meteorologist, and on YouTube, follow Rob Jones Hurricane. You can find the Meteorology Matters playlist there too. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the fascinating world of weather. Stay curious and stay safe out there.